Howdy, welcome. This is my presentation on self-presentation in online environments and on social media. So we'll talk about a couple things. First of all, we'll talk about what self-presentation is, then we'll talk about what the self is. From there we'll go into how impressions are created in sort of a computer-mediated environment, and lastly we'll finish up with self-presentation, computer-mediated communication, and what that truly looks like. So first of all, what is self-presentation? Well, self-presentation is a process, and it's the actions and efforts individuals take to influence or sway how others perceive you. That's how I defined it, but it is a process that's constantly ongoing. So people can take many steps on an online environment like filters, photo editing, using close friend stories to alter who can see you and get to know you, limiting who follows you. You can use all those to sort of influence your presentation and influence how you present yourself to people online. It's self-presentation is this process of putting out yourself in a way you want to other people. That being said, that brings us to our next point. What is this self that you're presenting? What is the self? Well, the self is how you view yourself. It is a person's understanding of their being. And this can look two different ways. One is your actual self, how you actually view yourself. If you're cutting back all the different silly things that you think about yourself and being humble and being realistic, how you view yourself. For example, I view myself as someone who as how I dress, I view myself as someone who dresses comfortably and focuses on comfort over looking good. But my ideal self, the ideal self is how you think of yourself on your best day. Like, not how you really are, but what you think of yourself when you're thinking highly of yourself or in a prideful sense. For me, I think of myself as someone who's able to dress stylish and dresses cool. That's not necessarily the exact same as my actual self. My ideal self thinks that me dressing comfortably can also look cool, which isn't always the case, but it can be the case. The ideal self and actual self can overlap, but they're not necessarily the same. And the thing this has to do with self-presentation is usually in self-presentation, you want people to see your ideal self or the best version of yourself. Self-presentation is all about putting the best version of yourself forward, not necessarily the most true version of yourself. We'll get to that later, but the best version of yourself for better social outcomes. So that's what the self has to do with self-presentation. Now, when you're presenting yourself, there's impressions that come with it. And now we're going to talk about how impressions are created and formed in computer-mediated communication. To understand self-presentation, we need to understand this first. So, there's a good theory called Social Information Processing Theory, or SIP. First of all, thank you, Valdosta State University, for having some good resources on explaining SIP, as well as the Ellison study on managing impressions online. Thank you for those two resources. They helped a lot with this. But social information processing theory is basically a theory on explaining how people develop impressions of each other. Now, usually people use different cues to develop impressions and other things to pick up on how a person is or who they are, such as nonverbals like my posture or my facial expressions, or some verbal cues. Those are other things like my accent or like different quirks or stuff that I have when I'm speaking. Obviously the words are always constant, but these verbal cues and nonverbal cues, the thing that's important to know is a lot of these are stripped away when you're in computer-mediated communication. You don't have access to a lot of those. So the question is, what happens in that sort of situation? Well, what SIP explains is in that situation, the senders and receivers of messages adapt, and they basically pick up on other things and put greater influence on other cues in order to develop those. And usually that happens with differing results, but we'll get to that in a second. And ultimately, another thing SIP explains is that this is an important thing as we go into a couple of the future topics we're about to cover, but and you have enough impressions over a period of time, SIP says that in computer-mediated communication, you can develop a relationship to a similar depth as face-to-face through duration of communication and how much you're communicating. And the thing that's important to note is that in computer-mediated communication, that does not necessarily mean the person's actual identity to actual identity. That can mean persona to persona, username to username. Now let's get into self-presentation and CMC, what that actually looks like practically. First of all, we're about to put all the pieces together. So we add all together asynchronous communication, people being able to manipulate, not necessarily manipulate, but be able to alter and process what they send before they say it, less cues, like we talked about with SIP, for people to use, and more anonymous capabilities for interaction. That leads to people using technology to manipulate how others see them. And manipulate's a very strong word, and there's definitely negative connotation, but sometimes that can be neutral too. One way people use the internet to self-present is through self-disclosure. Like I mentioned earlier, you can use close friend stories and choose who you let follow you to impact who sees what you're really doing online. That's self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is the process of choosing to alter how much people can see about you. And like I said, private stories, you can some people create second accounts for only their friends to follow and having a main account. But there's many steps that people can take to alter how much of yourself you're presenting. For example, my private story, I'll present my more actual self to my friends. In regular Instagram, I'll be more ideal self. So I have that level of self-disclosure. Now, there's another aspect of computer-mediated communication, and that's hyper-personal communication. This typically comes in the same sort of boat as SIP. SIP says when you have that period of communication online and you communicate enough, you can have that regular relationship. Now, hyper-personal communication takes that a little further. That theory is basically saying if you have enough positive interactions over a long enough period of time without the proper amount of cues that you normally have in face-to-face, it can lead to a relationship that is more surreal and more personal and intimate with a person that you truly don't know. It's a weird thing where you feel like you know someone super well, and you do, but you don't actually know the person. Typically, this is something you see with people getting to know each other really well online and communicating a lot, but not really knowing their identities. And how this relates to self-presentation is basically to have a hyper-personal communication. It takes enough positive impressions based off someone's self-presentation over a period of time to have that. This is the byproduct of what self-presentation can cause online. Last, we'll sort of touch on the dark side of self-presentation. Self-presentation, like I said, can be manipulated to sort of be used in ways to get people to do things not necessarily that they don't want to, but basically baiting people and deceiving them. One of the ways that happens is just being fake online, where it's like you act one way online and you're different in reality. That's a big thing I remember talking about in middle school. People would always complain about how other people are fake. That's the example of self-presentation online not matching how it is in reality. Another notable way this happens is through something called catfishing, which happens when different people are just acting as a different persona than they are. So like, let's say I'm acting as Batman online, and I'm talking to someone and becoming friends with someone under the name of Batman. I'm not actually Batman. So if I would meet someone online, I would actually catfish them. And that's not okay. That is manipulating someone through self-presentation online. That is it. Thank you for listening, and have a good evening.